In order to please his lover, Eric left me on the side of the road. I had a serious car accident and was on the brink of death when I suddenly saw bullet comments drifting across the night sky. Vera died, and then her body double took over, trapped in a plot full of repeated abuse. The most pitiable one is Chris, not realizing that the person he had liked for so long died so close to him. With the last bit of strength, I dialed the phone of my archenemy Chris. I didn't die and ended up in Chris's hands. He pinched my chin, a cold smile playing on his lips. On the day I die, I will definitely take Vera to be buried with me. His intention was to be buried together even in death. What else but true love is that? Love my foot. He clearly just wants to kill me. The next moment, Chris lowered his head and kissed me. I had a big fight with Eric and he left me on the side of the road. The reason for the argument was the new intern in his company, Laura. They say she looks like me, but younger and softer in attitude. While in the car, Eric received a distress call from her. On the phone, she cried saying she drank too much and was being harassed outside a bar. I turned to him with a sneer and asked, if she's being harassed, why didn't she call the police instead of you? On the other end of the line, Laura heard my voice, apologizing in a tearful tone. I'm sorry for disturbing you. Although Eric and I have known each other since childhood, our relationship has grown cold after being pressured into a business union by our families. We each have our own affairs and don't interfere with each other. But for some reason, I just couldn't stand Laura. I even dare say I hated her. Eric made a call to his assistant to pick up Laura before turning to me, sneering. Why do you hate Laura so much? Are you jealous? I wasn't jealous. I just hated her. My voice trailed off, suddenly noticing a line of words floating in the sky outside the windshield. I scoffed. Not only do I hate her, I kind of hate you too. If she doesn't disappear, I'm calling off the engagement. Not long after, the assistant called. Eric, Laura got drunk and went to the riverside. She seems like she wants to jump. I suddenly remembered my dad's former affair partner, who also sought death and life. I felt my temper flare up. If you go to her today, we're breaking off the engagement. His eyebrows furrowed slightly, with a darkening gaze, a sign of his impending anger. You want her dead? The car door unlocked. Eric's voice was chilling. Get out. And I was just as willing to leave Eric's presence. I pulled open the car door and got out. The black Maybach disappeared quickly into the endless twilight. Only then did I realize I seemed to have been abandoned in the desolate outskirts. I stood on the side of the road, holding onto my phone trying to find a signal. A glaring light suddenly shone from the side. The next moment, I was knocked to the ground by a speeding car. My lower leg was crushed by the tire. A searing pain of fractured bones shot through me. The driver, fearing trouble, didn't even spare a glance at me and sped off. Bleeding beneath me, I endured the pain, clutching my phone tightly. Fortunately, my phone finally got a slight signal. I mustered all my strength, dialed Eric's number. As soon as it connected, the call was hung up directly. This was the outskirts, and the nearest hospital was at least an hour's drive away. I felt like I probably wouldn't last until the ambulance arrived. The sky was darkening. I curled up on the concrete, the scent of blood in my nose and breath. I could clearly feel life seeping away from my body bit by bit as I prepared to call for emergency help. Then, I saw a line of words drifting across the night sky once again. When the ambulance arrived, she had lost too much blood and died. So tragic. If Eric knew he had just hung up on Vera's plea for help before her death, he would probably regret it for the rest of his life. Whether he would regret it or not, he would surely come to hate Laura because of this incident. The most pitiful one is Chris, not knowing the person he had liked for so long died so close to him, then went mad and turned into a villain. The ending must not be good. I blinked, confirming that I did see Chris's name. He seemed so close to me. I shifted my body, the will to survive giving me that last bit of strength to dial Chris's number. The call was quickly answered, his voice indifferent. Speak. I felt like crying. We had been so hostile before. I had never expected him not to hang up on my call. With a weak, trembling voice, I said to the person on the other end of the phone, I'm in a car accident, dying, save me. He paused for a moment, then asked immediately, where are you? I gave the address and didn't hang up the call. Shaking from pain, unable to say anything, in a daze, all I heard were Chris's words asking me not to be afraid. He seemed to have never said so much to me before. We had plotted against each other, fought tooth and nail before, but at this moment, I just felt he was the best person in the world. Moonlight pierced through the thin clouds, casting a glow on the ground. As the cold wind passed by, my body temperature dropped along with the loss of blood. Shaking all over, struggling to open my eyes, through the blurry vision tainted with blood, I saw Chris rushing towards me in a panic. Before the world plunged into darkness again, A line of words appeared before my eyes once more. Was Vera saved? She didn't die. Why does it feel different from the usual novel plots? Suddenly it seemed intriguing, so I read on. During the half-month of coma, I gradually understood. The words I saw were called bullet comments. It was through the bullet comments that I learned that I was a supporting character who died early in a novel. Eric was the male lead, Laura was the female lead, and after my death, Laura, with a face similar to mine, became my replacement, starting a deep and abusive love story with Eric. I thought Eric had no feelings for me anymore, but it turned out that he always had me in his heart. After my death, he still couldn't forget me, so much so that he had both love and hate for Laura. Honestly, I found the plot of this novel quite disgusting. I hadn't even found peace after death, becoming a part of the abusive love between the male and female leads. On the day I opened my eyes, the bullet comments started to appear again, with a lot of words. Vera woke up. She really didn't die. Eric still thought she had just disappeared out of anger, and kept hanging out with Laura all day, still waiting for her to apologize. My fingers moved lightly, and Chris, who was lying by the bed, immediately opened his eyes. He stared at me blankly, and quickly called the doctor. While the doctor was examining me, he sat next to me, his gaze fixed on me intently. After listening carefully to the doctor's instructions, he walked over. As he approached, I noticed the dark circles under his eyes. It seemed like he had really been keeping watch over me day and night. He looked down at me, his expression dark and unclear. "Why did you call me?" I didn't know how to explain, so I just hoarsely said, "I accidentally dialed your number. Thank you for saving me." Chris's dark eyes were cold. "The doctor said you don't have any major problems now. Since you're awake, call your fiancé to come pick you up." "Chris," I called out softly, "maybe we can be friends." With his tall figure backlit, the darkness deepened under his brow, and he coldly said, "Vera, being friends with you would cost me billions." Chris had climbed up from the bottom step by step. He had no background, no way out, so his methods were ruthless. He would do anything to snatch business deals, gaining a notorious reputation in the business world. 3 years ago, he had snatched 2 projects from Eric successively. In retaliation, I had deliberately approached him. Surprisingly, he wasn't very guarded against me, and soon I, along with Eric, snatched away the most important deal from him, causing him a loss of billions. This money might not be a big deal for Chris now, but 3 years ago, it was a fatal blow that nearly broke him. The last time we met, he had threatened me as he fiercely pinched my face. "Vera, next time, I will personally kill you." But this time, instead of killing me, he saved my life. I watched him walk away, and sighed softly. He probably won't have anything to do with me in this lifetime. Then, another line of bullet comments floated before me. "Call him honey and see if he responds." Prompted by this unexpected suggestion, I hesitantly whispered, "Honey." Chris stopped in his tracks, standing at the door, looking tense all over. He had actually heard it. I stared at the buzzing bullet comments on the screen, my ears turning red, wishing for a hole to crawl into. Chris slowly turned around, asking me, "Are you out of your mind?" I buried my head in the blanket, peeking at him through a slit. According to the bullet comments, Laura was the daughter born from my dad's affair back then, and now my dad had acknowledged her. Following the plot, after my death, my dad had Laura marry Eric as my replacement. With a new daughter now, my dad didn't seem too sad about my death, even though he had begged me to agree to marry Eric for the sake of his company. It seemed my interests would never be as important as his. Rather than going back now and being treated as a pawn by my dad, forced to marry Eric, I would rather pretend to have lost my mind. Emerging from the blanket, I told Chris, "Initially my dad made me marry you to repay a debt. Even though it was a business marriage, you don't have to be so indifferent towards me, we can be friends." The night was deep. Chris's figure blended into the darkness, his deep eyes unfathomable. I coughed weakly and said, "Chris, I want some water." He went to the table to pour a glass of water, then walked over, holding me up gently and started feeding me water. "Vera, if I find out you're lying to me again, I really will kill you." His voice was menacingly cold. Shaking slightly at the warning, I started coughing suddenly, choked by the water. Chris set down the water, patting my back lightly, a faint laugh escaping him. "Slow down, your face is all red." After my breathing eased, Chris tucked me in, sitting by the bed, feeling my forehead for temperature, and then making a call to his assistant. With fingers that had a hint of calluses, he gently toyed with the loose strands of hair on my forehead, his deep black eyes carefully assessing my expression. "Did you just say your mind is broken?" I was dumbfounded. I wasn't fully healed yet, and had only planned to play dumb for a while, avoiding Eric's wedding. It seemed like I had attracted the wrong attention. If I had known, I would have continued pretending to be dead. I tilted my head away, avoiding his touch. There's nothing between us. It was agreed upon before the engagement. This marriage contract is just a business relationship. No interference in other aspects. Chris realized I mistook him for Eric. He squinted his narrow eyes slightly and asked Vera, "Do you know what kind of person I am?" I shrank my neck, whispering softly, "A good person." In the dark, Chris looks cold and intimidating, but I was tired and sleepy. Soon fell asleep with my eyes closed. In a moment of blurry consciousness, I smelled a faint woody scent mingled with my breath, fleeting. The bullet curtain now. "Chris, you're just 0.1 centimeters away. Why did you stop? And you even dare not to kiss her? Chris, what's wrong with you?" The doctor said that after the car accident, I might have memory confusion, so mistaking people was normal. Maybe it will get better after a while. I don't know what Chris is thinking. He didn't deny that he was my fiancé, and he came to see me every day. The bullet curtain says he is doing this to avoid upsetting me and help me recover. It seems like all the kindness he has left in his life is used on me, but I'm so temperamental and willful. Eric couldn't stand my temper a long time ago. Chris shouldn't like me. 2 days ago, I threw a tantrum in the hospital, and Chris took me home. After knowing my brain was messed up, his temper and patience seemed surprisingly good. No matter how I acted, he never seemed to get angry. The people around him even thought he was the one with a messed up brain. The weather quickly turned to early summer, and the sunshine through the blinds brought the taste of sunshine even in the breeze. My legs have been treated and I can finally walk now. Chris was sitting beside my bed, slowly peeling an apple. The light gold sprinkled on his bangs, and when he looked up, the sunlight just brushed over his cold black eyes, creating a gentle illusion. It took me a long time to snap out of it, and I took the apple from his hand, took a bite, tossed it on the ground. "Tastes bad." Chris frowned slightly, showing a hint of impatience. Indeed, anyone couldn't stand someone like me. During the 2 months I disappeared, even my dad and Eric didn't care about me, never tried to find me. It's good that Chris woke up early and knew what kind of person I was. Who knew? He stood up directly, picked up the apple from the ground, rinsed it quickly with water from the kettle, then bit into it, narrowing his black eyes as he looked at me. There was a hint of danger in his expression. I immediately shrank back and said softly, "I bit into that apple." Chris smiled coldly at the corner of his mouth. Vera's never been hungry, doesn't understand the value of food. It seemed like the first time he was angry at me after all this time. He finished the apple and quickly went to the company. He started from scratch and was busy every day. Although he came to see me every day, during the 2 months of recovery, our time together was limited. Most of what I know about him comes from the bullet curtain. At that moment, more bullet comments floated across the screen. Chris has been an orphan since he was a kid, fought stray dogs to save food, started underground boxing at 14, and took numerous beatings, just to have a meal. Only Chris remembered Vera after she died, but this spoiled brat like her really didn't deserve him going crazy for her later. Think about 3 years ago, Vera just casually mentioned eating strawberry souffle with him the next day, but she stole his business and disappeared. Chris waited for her in the rain that day. At night, I tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. I planned to go back and destroy the contracts I signed with Eric. Those businesses would naturally fall into Chris's hands. As long as our family and Eric no longer worked together, Chris would have no competitors. How could I have no conscience? I lay in bed, looking at the screen full of accusations of my lack of conscience, then suddenly sat up from the bed. In the quiet of the night, I sighed deeply. I really deserved to die. I got up from the bed, grabbed the crutch beside the bed, and went to the kitchen. I turned on the kitchen light, limped to the fridge, took out ingredients. Because I'm picky, the fridge has almost everything, and making a souffle was no problem. After cooking the batter, squeezing some cream on it, and placing fresh strawberries on top, I looked at the exquisite dessert on the plate and snorted coldly. Let's see who dares to say I'm not sorry to Chris. Did you call me? My body stiffened, slowly turned around to look at Chris, who was leaning lazily against the door frame. I didn't know how long he had been standing there, but I quickly found the answer from the bullet comments. It seems he's been here since shortly after I entered the kitchen. I couldn't help but complain. Are you a ghost? Standing behind people with no sound. He walked into the kitchen, pulled his lips. Why didn't you call someone if you wanted to eat? Why sneak into the kitchen in the middle of the night like a ghost? I pushed the souffle towards him. I made it for you. Earlier, I realized I said the wrong thing and quickly fell silent. Chris was taken aback for a moment, then tilted his head slightly to look at me. Just remembered everything. Finally stopped calling me husband randomly. After calling me once, I pursed my lips and said, I wasn't the one you were calling. The smile in Chris' eyes disappeared instantly, and he lowered his voice to ask, "Then who were you calling?" As I stood on one foot, I subconsciously took a step back. My foot stumbled, almost causing me to fall. Chris quickly caught me by the waist, lifted me up, and sat me down on the kitchen island. "Don't move." His low voice sounded particularly alluring in the silent night. My breathing suddenly became erratic. With his hands on my sides, he glanced at the plate and asked, "Did you make this for me?" I nodded lightly. "But I don't like eating sweets. If you don't want it, just throw it away." I paused and said playfully, "Feed it to the dog." Chris picked up the spoon and started eating from the plate, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You cook well." Suddenly, he handed the spoon to my lips. "Taste it." There were pink barrage comments flashing on the screen, in addition to the man in front of me. I realized that the interaction between Chris and I seemed overly ambiguous. I turned my head slightly and said, "I don't eat these at night. It'll make me gain weight." Chris pinched my chin, forcing me to look up at him. "If you don't eat it, I might think there's poison in this cake." He chuckled, and a strange emotion filled his dark eyes. "I can't die alone, right?" I bit into the cake on the spoon and glared at him, calling him a dog. Vera didn't get mad, but laughed, feeding me while eating herself. The sweet smell lingered in the air as we quickly finished the soufflé on the plate, even though there were only the two of us in the kitchen. However, the constant barrage of comments made me feel like we were being watched and monitored, making me extremely uncomfortable. After eating, I jumped nervously off the kitchen island. My mind went blank for a moment, and I almost forgot about my injured left leg. When I realized it, I gasped in shock and absent-mindedly grabbed the collar of Chris' robe, pulling it open to reveal his toned chest. I leaned forward, burying my head in his chest. There was a bit of cream on his chest, gently rising and falling, leading down to chiseled abs with faint scars visible on the skin. The situation was too awkward. I froze on the spot until a voice came from above my head. "Vera, what are you trying to do?" I looked up and met his cryptic gaze, only to realize that the barrage comments had all disappeared. I looked at Chris, my eyes unfocused. "I just want to go back to sleep." "Your leg's injured, don't move around." The next moment, my body became light as he lifted me up. His woody scent filled my nostrils, making me nervous, and the fingertips clutching his shoulders tightened suddenly. Furrowing his brows slightly, he looked down at me. "Are you a cat?" I quickly released his shoulders, placing my hands on his chest with nowhere else to put them. It felt like this gesture was still inappropriate. Chris carried me steadily toward the bedroom, chuckling softly. "If your mind is back to normal, how should I handle you?" I innocently looked at him. "I don't understand what you're saying, honey." Chris gazed at me. "Do you think I made it this far by being deceived?" Chris was becoming harder and harder to fool. He gently laid me on the bed, and I reached up to embrace his neck, planting a soft kiss on his cheek. His body stiffened, looking bewildered. I blushed and whispered softly to him, "Good night." The next morning, I was awakened by a phone call. I closed my eyes and reached for the vibrating phone under my pillow. It was the secretary's voice on the other end. "Vera, Eric asked me about your whereabouts yesterday. I was currently using my private phone number. Only the secretary could contact me." I rubbed my eyes. "How did you respond to him?" I asked. "I told him you went to Europe for business and wouldn't be back for a while. But next month is your wedding day. Aren't you planning to come back?" I rolled over and continued speaking. "I'm planning to run away from the wedding. If he loves to marry someone, let him." "You're right. Even if we're engaged, I can't just pick any jerk." I'm awake now. I stared at the ceiling and suddenly remembered Eric's saying something about feeling fresh when he met Laura. At that time, I didn't understand the hidden meaning in his words, but after meeting Chris again, I did feel quite refreshed. It was actually quite interesting to think about. As soon as I finished speaking, I locked eyes with a pair of dark eyes in the corner, and my blood ran cold. It was Chris. I stood there in a daze, my mind unable to process anything. My face turned pale, and I hurriedly ended the call and hid the phone behind me. "What are you doing here?" The barrage of comments in front of my eyes. Why was Chris still wearing the same robe from last night? Did he stay here all night? I snapped back to reality, trembling as I asked him in a shaky voice, You were here all night." Chris propped his head on his hand, staring at me, and simply said, "I was wondering all night why you kissed me, and before I knew it, it was morning." Can a person really think about that all night? This person must have some issues. I tried to calm myself down. Nope, couldn't calm down at all. Chris stayed in my room all night. That means he heard everything I said to the secretary on the phone earlier. I'm really in trouble now. Chris stood up, walked slowly towards me, and smirked coldly. "I didn't understand it at first, but when I heard you on the phone just now, I got it." He grabbed my wrist, looked down at me menacingly, and said harshly, "Vera, so all this time, you've been playing me." Veins bulged on his forehead. He was really angry. The grip on my wrist became stronger, and for a moment, I felt like my bones were going to be crushed. I winced in pain, and he relaxed his grip a bit, immediately letting go. I rubbed my wrist, dared not look up at him, and whispered in defense. "My mind seemed hazy from last night." Vera chuckled. "So when you called me honey last night, was that in your right mind? Tell me, how do you plan to toy with me this time?" I met his gaze with red eyes, tears welling up due to the physical pain around my eyes. "No, I haven't," I replied. He reached out, lightly brushed the corner of my eye with his slightly rough fingertips, while the other hand held my reddened wrist, gently caressing it. "That's not going to work. You can't leave in the middle of the game, or I will retaliate against you." Before I could react, he lowered his head and bit me hard at the base of my thumb. I couldn't help but curse at him, but he didn't get mad. Instead, he looked down at me with a slight smile. "Psycho," I cursed in my mind. Suddenly, my phone behind me rang. Before I could react, Chris snatched my phone and answered it. Soon, Eric's voice came from the other end of the phone. "Vera, our wedding is next month. Where did you go?" Eric took the secretary's phone. Chris's expression darkened. I reached out to grab the phone from his hand, but he took a step back, and I ended up falling into his arms. He held my fingers, and the warmth of his palm slowly spread to mine. I mouthed to him, "I don't want to marry him. Don't let him find me." Chris paused for a moment, his icy glare instantly melting. On the phone, Eric started to threaten me. "Vera, I know you're trying to dodge marriage. If you don't show up at the wedding next week, I won't mind finding a new bride. You don't know, your family has more than one daughter now. Even if you disappear, you can't stop the alliance between the two families." With narrowed eyes, Chris gently played with my fingers, his voice lazy. "She's out of her mind now. She won't marry you." Eric hesitated. "Who are you? Why do you have Vera's phone?" "Right now, she's in my hands," Vera said, looking at me with a flustered expression, then laughed. Chris held me in his embrace, his actions forceful yet gentle. The woody fragrance on him invaded my senses, making me flustered and unable to move. "Vera," Eric gritted his teeth, calling my name. Before he could finish, Vera hung up the phone and tossed it aside. She reached out, gently rubbing my scalp, and asked softly, "Do you want me to deal with your fiancé?" I sat there dumbfounded, my mind blank. It wasn't until the barrage of comments on the screen filled my eyes that I realized I must have nodded just now. Has my mind really gone astray? Chris's slightly rough fingertips traced along my ear, the side of my face, and finally lingered on my lips. After a moment, a hint of amusement appeared in his eyes. "Relax." His deep, restrained voice was alluring. I closed my eyes tightly, then opened them. "No, knowing someone is watching makes it impossible." I was about to say something, when there was a knock on the door. Chris immediately let go of me. His assistant entered the room. "Boss, there's a document that needs your urgent signature." Chris took the document, lowered his gaze, and suppressed the desire in his eyes. I breathed a sigh of relief. I looked up and met Chris's assessing gaze. He handed the document to the assistant, then leaned in close to my ear. "I'm busy today. I'll come find you tonight." My mind blanked out, and I asked him, "Don't you ever sleep?" He chuckled, "Then clean up and wait for me tonight." I stared blankly at Chris's retreating figure. Suddenly, I realized he might have misunderstood. That night, the maid helped me take a bath. I don't know if it was Chris's intention, but even the shower gel had a special floral scent. I waited nervously until late at night, but Chris didn't show up. I sat on the sofa by the window, reading a book, and fell asleep without realizing it. A loud noise woke me up. I opened my eyes in a panic and saw Chris standing at the door with his hands in his pockets, looking grim. "Vera, did you sleep well?" He only called me that when he was angry. I looked up at him and asked, "What's wrong?" The night light by the bed illuminated his eyes, dark and cold once again. He stared at me quietly for a while. "I lost a business deal today, just like 3 years ago, because of a leak of confidential company information. It wasn't me this time." Vera was so desperate to deny it. Chris slightly bent down, grabbed my wrist, and said, "I saved your life, but you're still scheming against me. Do you have a heart?" His voice was devoid of any warmth, and suddenly, he pinned me down on the sofa. With his icy breath so close, I stared at him wide-eyed. "Chris, what are you trying to do?" He held my chin, a cold smirk playing on his lips. "You should know, it took stepping on many people for me to get here today. When I have nothing left, I will be dead and buried, and the day I die, I will drag Vera down with me. No, he doesn't love me, he's trying to kill me." I blinked. Another barrage of comments flashed before my eyes. It was another classic abusive romance from a novel. No one speaks up even with misunderstandings, and even if they like each other, they can't say it. If only the misunderstanding could be cleared up. I calmed down and looked up at him. I already said it wasn't me. You should investigate the mole in your company. Besides, I'm starting to like you now and won't harm you anymore. The coldness in Chris's eyes dissipated, leaving him stunned. He stared at me, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips. Even if you were lying to me this time, Vera, I'd still accept it, he said. And then, he excitedly leaned down to nibble on my earlobe. Before I could scold him, his lips fiercely met mine. The light dimmed before my eyes, the noisy words vanished in an instant, and I found myself enveloped in his towering figure. Outside the window, the night was tranquil. The only sounds were of breathing and the chaotic rhythm of heartbeats. With one hand on the back of my head and the other holding my fingers, our palms intertwined, fingers tightly interlocked. The fragrance of flowers wafting in from the terrace, mixed with Chris's woody scent, assaulted all my senses. His steady breathing by my ear grew heavier, slowly stealing my breath away, until I was suffocating. Just as I struggled to breathe, he finally let me go. His fingers brushed off a hint of bloody mark on his pale lips, and he stared at me with a smile. You can be quite the biter too. Quite like me, he said in a low, seductive voice that carried a hint of allure in the late night. Suddenly remembering something, he squinted slightly at me, almost forgot. You've been waiting for me to sleep all day. Before I could grasp the situation, he lifted me up and tossed me onto the soft bed without any warning. The next moment, he secured my waist, pulling me close and whispered, "Sleep." I stared at him in astonishment, but he lightly pinched my waist. Your leg isn't healed yet, and I'm not a beast. Disappointed, I dared not speak and quickly closed my eyes. Perhaps Chris had a love-struck brain, but it surely wasn't addled. He took my phone and began investigating the leaked information incident, quickly discovering the traitor, one of his trusted aides, who had been bribed by Eric. On the day I was cleared of suspicion, he returned my phone to me. Upon turning it on, a flood of missed calls and messages from Eric filled the screen, all in anticipation of our impending wedding. As the wedding date approached, he seemed genuinely anxious. With a tinge of apology in his tone, Chris said, "Sorry, I misunderstood you." Looking at my phone without lifting my eyelids, I replied, "With my history, it's normal for you to suspect me. I'd have doubted myself too, if I were in your shoes." Chris paused before continuing, "But I took your phone and didn't allow you to leave." Puzzled, I replied, "My leg is injured. The doctor advised me to rest." What door could I possibly go out through? A light laugh came from above me, and Chris's voice was surprisingly gentle. "Then let me do something for you." After some thought, I said, "I want to attend tomorrow's wedding." Feeling a sense of relief, I heard Chris agree. "All right." In relief, I thought to myself, Chris couldn't be that crazy after all. The smile on Chris's lips faded, replaced by possessiveness in his cold, dark eyes. I also got an invitation, but I need a female companion. Surprisingly, Chris took the initiative to massage my leg before bedtime. Despite his wild nature, he displayed unexpected tenderness in that moment. He must have felt guilty for the misunderstanding. I watched him squat in front of me, lips curved in a smirk, and thought that his care was well deserved. Chris raised an eyebrow, looking at me with a mocking smile. "Who's the fox now? Your whole family are foxes." With my ankle in his hand, his dark eyes momentarily darkened as he asked, "Is your leg better?" I nodded. The doctor said it's almost healed. Slightly frantic to save myself once, I had indeed said I liked him. I pulled my leg back in embarrassment. "If I say I like you, will you believe it so easily?" Chris's cold gaze lingered on my flushed ears for a moment before he smiled, bringing my chin up to meet his lips. After a brief kiss, he pulled away, locking eyes with me. What we didn't do that day, will continue now. Confused, it took me a moment to realize his meaning as he pinned me down, and the words on the screen disappeared completely. Lightly kissing my neck, he propped himself up to gaze at my expression. The room dimmed as the moonlight illuminated the hard contours of his face. In that moment, I could hear my own accelerating heartbeat. "Scared?" he asked. Defiantly, I gasped, pushed against him, and scolded, "Chris, what I meant by sleep that day was not this." He held my hands, his warm body temperature seeping into mine, and smirked mischievously. "Save some energy, you can scold me later." Leaning down, he silenced my protests with a firm kiss. Tracing my hair, down my arm, and capturing my struggling hand, he led me into the infinite darkness. The next morning, as I opened my eyes, I felt sore all over as if I had fallen apart. Chris held me tightly and pulled the duvet that had slipped off my waist back up to cover me. Suddenly, a barrage of nonsensical comments popped up on the screen in front of us. I blushed and quickly yanked the duvet back from Chris. On his tan abs, there were a few faint scratch marks. The world fell silent again. Chris stared at me and raised an eyebrow teasingly, Are you really that shy? I didn't say anything, picked up the watch he had left on the pillow, glanced at it, then tossed it onto him. The wedding is over. Yesterday you promised to take me with you. Chris's dark eyes sparkled with mischief. Eric was going to marry someone else. How could I possibly take you and ruin it? That's why he tortured me all night, to play this trick. I kicked him in anger. I was supposed to settle the score with them by going back. But now the wedding is over. How am I supposed to settle the score? Chris grabbed my foot, chuckling. Your legs have just recovered. You better not kick too hard. There's a thank you banquet at your place tonight, and I'll take you there. Almost forgot. There's a thank you banquet after the wedding. My legs trembled as I got out of bed. I tried to stand up, but ended up plopping back down. Images of last night's intensity rushed back into my mind, making me want to kick Chris again. I looked at him and extended my foot, gritting my teeth. Help me put on my shoes. Chris squatted in front of me and helped me put on my shoes. I reached out and patted the feathers scattered in his dark hair. He chuckled softly. Vera, are you petting a dog? I replied, the dog is quite obedient. Back home, everyone looked at me as if they had seen a ghost. Didn't Vera run away from the wedding? Why is she back? Obviously, she regrets it. Unfortunately, Eric has already married Laura. It's too late for her to regret now. Eric finished the wine in his glass, saw me, and momentarily lost focus. He walked unsteadily through the crowd and came up to me. Vera, what does your presence here mean? Do you regret it? As long as you admit defeat, I'll divorce her immediately and marry you. I have been thinking of you all along. I was with Laura just to make you jealous. It seemed he had quite a bit to drink, even revealing his true feelings. I only found out from the comments on the screen. Even though he had married Laura now, I was still that unforgettable person in his heart. But it seemed like he had forgotten. I wasn't as good as they thought. I was pretty bad. I raised my glass to him and smiled faintly. I'm just here to wish you well. I wish you and Laura a happy future. Eric looked at me with a hint of affection. That's not your true feelings, is it? Of course not. My true feelings are quite different. He had already gotten married, yet he still looked at me with those eyes. Disgusting, isn't it? I didn't want to talk to him much, so I walked past him. He reached out to grab my wrist, but I evaded him. I splashed the red wine from my glass on his face. Don't touch me, go away. The next moment, a glass of red wine was splashed on my dress. I looked up and saw Laura. She stood in front of Eric, biting her lip, speaking timidly. Vera, if you're here to cause trouble, please leave. This is my home. Now, it's my home too. I coldly stared at Laura. Let's see if you can still stay. With those words, I passed through the onlookers and went upstairs. Back in my room, I picked out a dress from the wardrobe. After changing into the dress, subtitles flashed before my eyes. I must be the vicious supporting character they talked about, constantly seeking trouble, and eventually meeting a bad end. If I wanted to change the outcome, I had to please Eric. Becoming friends with Laura, doing such disgusting things, was worse than being a villain all my life, with whatever ending that awaited me. Suddenly, I couldn't zip up my dress properly. I cursed under my breath. That jerk Chris knows my foot is injured. I can't exercise, and yet forces me to eat so much food every day, making me gain weight. The sound of the door opening came from behind me. My dress zipper was grasped and pulled up a bit. Thinking it was the maid, I took a deep breath and said, pull harder. A mocking laugh sounded. What? Was Vera not satisfied with my service last night? The zipper was pulled down. A gentle kiss landed on my back. Warm breath brushed against my neck. I stiffened, turned my head, and saw Chris. How did you come up here? There are so many people outside. Climbed over the wall. No one saw. How shamelessly Chris could say such things, because there are even more shameless things to do. Chris flipped me over, lifted me onto the dressing table, held my chin, and kissed me fiercely. He was off somehow, forceful, not giving me a chance to breathe. I struggled to catch my breath and pounded against him until he finally let go. His hands leaned on either side of me with an absolute possessive posture, trapping me. Our breaths intertwined, a faint smell of alcohol lingering. In the dark night, he gazed at me intensely, his eyes filled with undisguised possessiveness. I panted, pounding against him. Jerk. Don't come at me when you're drunk. A hint of hostility flashed in his eyes, and he sneered. If I hadn't been drinking, I would have gone up there and gouged Eric's eyes out. He dared to look at you like that even after he got married. The way he talked, he really sounded like a villain. I tugged at his tie. Don't be so bad. It won't end well for you. What ending? It'll be a very gruesome death. He leisurely removed his watch, smiling at me. And I'll take you with me at that time. He lowered his head and kissed me, silencing the unspoken words in my throat. After tossing and turning for half an hour, Chris finally left through the window. I changed clothes and sat in front of the dressing table, covering up the ambiguous traces on my body, and then the barrage reappeared. My legs felt weak as I walked downstairs. All the guests in the hall had their eyes on me. Chris stood in the crowd, suit and tie, wearing gold-rimmed glasses. He looked quite like a wolf in sheep's clothing. I casually shifted my gaze away, and as I walked down the last step, my father suddenly stood in front of me. "What are you doing here now? Do you want to ruin the engagement between two families?" he asked. I raised my eyes coldly and looked at him. "I've been missing for so long, but you never looked for me. During this time, you found a new daughter, and you arranged for her to marry Eric instead of me, making our family a laughingstock." With those words, my father publicly slapped me. My face turned to the side, with a faint taste of blood between my lips. The whole room fell silent. Chris, with a cold expression, was stopped by my gaze before he could do anything. My father pointed at me and scolded, "Get out." I have always been obedient, and never openly opposed my father like this before. "This is my home, not to mention," I sneered. "From now on, Laura is your daughter, and I am just myself." My secretary hurried to my side and handed me a document. After signing it, I threw the document directly in front of my father. "You always said the company was your life's work, so I didn't fight for it all these years, letting you sit comfortably in a high position. But you probably forgot that the company was built by my mom and you together, not solely by you. You probably don't know that before my mom passed away, she acquired a lot of shares in various companies and quietly left them to me. So now I am the largest shareholder in the company. Tomorrow, I'm going to hold a board meeting. Make sure you attend on time." My father looked at the document, completely dumbfounded. My eyes fell on a middle-aged woman behind my father. She was Laura's biological mother, my father's unforgettable first love after marriage. If I had really died in that car accident, what should have belonged to me and my mom would have ended up in her and Laura's hands. It's ridiculous to think about it. I bypassed my father and walked up to Eric's parents. "After I become the leader of the company, our cooperation with Eric's family ends today. It's hard for you to act out this drama of changing brides today." Eric's father turned pale with anger. "Not cooperate with Eric's family anymore? Who else would you do business with in the future then?" "I could." Chris's voice suddenly rang out. Eric's father looked at me with no change in my expression, and he chuckled with anger. "Everyone knows Chris is not one to hold back his true feelings. Are you really sure you want to give up Eric and work with him? As long as you're willing, today's wedding doesn't count. I can still make you marry Eric," Chris said. I laughed. "Your business is bigger than ours for a reason, still can say such words." Chris walked slowly to my side, turned his head and asked me, "Vera, don't you mind getting your hands dirty?" I was stunned for a moment. Chris coldly smirked. "Since you don't have the habit of picking up men from the trash can, you shouldn't stay here." I almost burst out laughing. Chris had such a sharp tongue. Throughout the whole event, Eric had been staring at me intently. He seemed to be muttering something to himself. After reading the barrage, I realized he was saying I would never find anyone who loved me as much as him in my life. If I insisted on walking into the fire, he wouldn't care about me anymore. No wonder Laura, who was standing next to him, was so upset. I didn't look at Eric again. I just followed Chris out. Just as we exited the door, my high heels twisted and my ankle felt a sharp pain. I looked at Chris's back and couldn't help but mutter, "Why walk so fast?" Chris heard my complaint and stopped, turning around to look at me. The next second, he directly squatted in front of me. "I'll give you a piggyback ride," he said. The people in the hall were all dumbfounded. After reading the barrage, I realized they were shocked not by the close relationship between Chris and me, but by the fact that Chris, who was known for his stubbornness, was so attentive to my words. As I looked at the man squatting in front of me, I was also a bit stunned. "What are you trying to do?" Chris smiled. "How long do you want me to squat for? Hurry up and get on." I pursed my lips and directly climbed onto Chris's back, letting him carry me away. With Chris carrying me, stepping on the mottled moonlight on the ground, we walked steadily towards the parking lot. In the quiet night, he suddenly spoke. "By the way, I have good news for you. The person who hit you with the car has been found. He got into an accident while speeding." "Is he dead?" I asked. "No," Chris replied. "So, what's the good news about that?" I continued. "He crashed into a cliff while being chased by the police. Right now, he's barely alive. If he survives, he'll probably spend the rest of his life in prison." I knew Chris's personality. An eye for an eye. This accident shouldn't be a true accident. I hugged his neck tightly and whispered softly, "If I had a personality like yours, would I still be bullied?" He paused for a moment. "You are fine as you are now. Let me handle some things for you." I lowered my eyes slightly, and a teardrop rolled down his neck. Chris put me in the passenger seat, took off his glasses, and gently placed his warm palm on my slightly swollen cheek. "Still hurting?" he asked. I sniffed. "You've done so much for me, but I haven't done anything for you." "Why?" His knuckles lightly brushed my cheek as he said, "Just make me a few more meals. I quite like them." I nodded in a daze. Chris started the car, driving carefully due to my recent accident. The journey was silent, with barrage of bullet comments flashing across the screen. Was Chris trying to propose to Vera just now? Why couldn't he say it? Afraid of rejection, maybe. In the confined silence, I could hear the sound of my heart beating faster. To be honest, I haven't figured out what Chris and I are now. But in the mall, we went from archenemies to partners in an instant, almost like a special kind of trust. While my secretary sent over the contract, his deputy general manager had the lawyer scrutinize it word by word, afraid I would play tricks. Chris, on the other hand, took the contract directly from the lawyer, signed it without even looking at it. The deputy general manager stomped his feet in anger, but Chris just smirked and threatened to transfer him to Antarctica if he said another word. After this, Chris came to me, his tone gentle. "Let me take you to dinner." I got into his car, took out a copy of the contract from my bag, and started explaining the terms to him. He seemed indifferent, glancing at the nearby alley. Suddenly, he asked, "I remember you have a bit of OCD. Should we go to the usual restaurant?" I suddenly saw a bullet comment. Chris probably wanted to take Vera to the street stall he used to frequent, but a girl like her would find it beneath her. I pursed my lips. "I'm tired of that. Why don't you take me to your favorite place?" He chuckled. "My favorite place might seem too rough for a lady like you." I turned to look at him. "I think you're pretty rough yourself, and I don't mind." Chris chuckled and accelerated, taking me to the Old Town area. Parking the black Bentley at the alley entrance, he grabbed my hand and led me to a shabby street stall, asking me again, "Are you sure you want to eat here?" "Sure," I replied, sitting on a plastic stool as Chris quickly ordered dishes. Despite being a street stall, the tableware was clean, washed with boiling water. As I watched him casually, memories of his difficult past surfaced, making me feel a twinge of sadness. The food arrived quickly, and he served me a dish. I looked at the smile on his face and said, "Tastes good." Then Chris brought up the topic of my father wanting to cut ties with me. He nodded. "They think I've been deceived by you, and soon, the whole company will be in your hands, causing bankruptcy." I retorted, "It's already good enough if I haven't deceived you." "I won't deceive you, Vera," he said softly. "You told me you liked me." "Was that true?" "Yes, it was true," I said. Chris laughed lightly. "You sound like you're lying now." I snapped and kicked his leg under the table, muttering, "Jerk. This doesn't sound like a lie." Suddenly, I understood the feeling of powerlessness described in the barrage of comments, even if I had the words. The neighborhood didn't seem safe. A few thugs at the next table eyed me maliciously. Chris took out money from his wallet and said, "Let's go. I'll cook you noodles at home." He pulled me up, draped his suit jacket over me, and led me out, urging me not to look back. As we walked, I heard footsteps behind us, realizing the thugs were following. Just when I was about to pick up the pace, Chris stopped me, sensing something was off. Turning around, I saw the thugs running away. Suddenly, several tall men appeared at the alley entrance. Before I could react, Chris stood in front of me, punching down a man who charged towards us. A flash of silver gleamed in the night. "Careful, they have knives," I shouted. Amid the sound of fists hitting flesh, Chris told me to find a place to hide. As I ran to a corner and fumbled for my phone to call the police, a man wielding a knife rushed towards me. It dawned on me that everything that happened today seemed to be aimed at me. Backing away in panic, just as the man's knife was about to stab my chest, Chris locked his neck from behind, causing him to fall. Chris urged me to run, but as I took a few steps, I stumbled. Feeling useless, Chris approached me slowly and joked, "Vera, what would I do without you?" Gazing at the men lying in disarray behind him, I almost collapsed into his arms in fear. Suddenly, I froze, moved my hand away from his back, and felt a warm, sticky sensation. Blood. Chris was injured, bleeding profusely under his black shirt. Next second, Chris collapsed, taking me down with him. His usually warm body now felt cold. Grasping his hand tightly, I stayed by his side as he was rushed into the emergency room, and then into the intensive care unit. The doctor said his condition was critical, his vital signs weak. Just like he had protected me, I guarded him. I wanted to treat him well, but Chris remained in a coma for 2 months. I started to hate him, curse him. "Chris, you jerk. Who allowed you to risk your life to save me without my consent? If you had died first, I would never forgive you. Even my own father wants to kill me. Why are you so good to me? A knock on the door came from behind me. I turned coldly and saw Chris's deputy standing there. What's up, Vera? Those two old people are already in jail. Not only your family's company, but Eric's company is done for as well, he said. I just nodded indifferently and replied, go handle it. The deputy immediately left. 2 months ago, those 4 people who stabbed Chris were arranged by my father. Their target was me. As long as I'm dead, the company will fall back into his hands. I've always known that I'm not important to him in terms of benefits, but I never thought he would want my life. He's my only relative. Besides Chris, it seems like no one cares about me in this world. And this world without Chris would be so dull. I knew people like my father must have dirty hands. So I went crazy, starting from my family's company, and uncovered many years of hidden secrets, implicating a lot of people. But now, the people trying to put me in a deadly situation have reached all the way to Paris. I leaned over Chris's bedside and muttered, I have something to tell you. Not only is it my dad, even Eric's people want to kill me. You have a chance now. Wake up and protect me. If you don't care about me, I'm as good as dead. As my eyelids grew heavier, I felt a gentle touch on my head. I opened my eyes and met Chris's gaze. I quickly rang the bell to call the doctor, but his hand rested lightly on my wrist, as if he had something to say to me. I leaned in closer, asking, if I died, would you want to be buried with me? His voice was soft and hoarse. The rain that had been falling for 2 months finally stopped, and the dark clouds gradually dispersed. The doctor said Chris was lucky to have survived the danger. Not long after, he finally moved to a regular ward. I sat by his bedside, peeling an apple. Chris leaned against the head of the bed, watching me lazily and smiled. Why don't you just give me the whole apple to eat? Then all that's left would be the core, he teased. I glared at him, continuing to peel the apple. You love it, or you don't. You love it. Chris took a bite of the apple and raised an eyebrow at me. Someone said that you've gone crazy while I was in a coma. I did it to avenge you, but I also dragged Vera into it. I have nothing left now. You better recover quickly, work well, and make money to compensate me, I said. Chris laughed. I'm still a patient, and you want me to work. Do you have no conscience? I shook my head. No, I'm a bad person. You can still regret now. I don't regret it. Chris smiled faintly. I'm willing to be tormented by you for a lifetime. After Eric went bankrupt, he left the country with his last bit of fortune to start over. Laura wanted to leave with him, but her biological mother forced her to be with another rich man. One day while I was shopping, I ran into her again. She came up to me, her eyes red with tears. Vera, I'm now separated from Eric. I have to be with someone I don't like every day. Do you know what kind of life I'm living now? She always looked so pitiful, as if the whole world owed her something. I replied calmly, if you don't like him, you can choose to leave. What does it have to do with me? She shook her head. He won't let me and my mother go. Vera, we're sisters by blood. Can't you help me? I found it funny. She didn't resist herself, so why should I help her? Laura, do I look like a good person to you? I said. I didn't lay a hand on you because I don't care about you. And if he's not letting you go, won't you call the police? If you bother me again, Laura, I will call the police. Later, I heard that the rich man Laura followed ended their engagement and left her. Not long after, Eric made some money with his overseas company and returned home. Chris was worried that he would seek revenge on me and didn't let me out of his sight every day. But to our surprise, Eric had long forgotten about me. The person he wanted revenge on was Laura, who betrayed him. I didn't expect that when I heard about them again, it was in the news. After returning home, Eric lured Laura to his family's old mansion's basement and kept her captive. After a week, Laura managed to escape when he wasn't paying attention and reported him to the police. She was taken to the hospital, beaten and barely alive. During Laura's hospitalization, Eric's family paid off her mother to have her write a forgiveness letter to Eric. Laura, who was usually weak, cut ties with her own mother and insisted on suing Eric. Luck was on her side, as a top lawyer suddenly appeared and helped her win the lawsuit for free, sending Eric to prison. I lazily leaned against Chris's chest, watching TV. He glanced down at me, chuckled softly, and his chest vibrated slightly. Vera, do you have a special fetish for tearing off my clothes? He teased. I took a sip of watermelon juice he handed me and replied, only this way can I have some peace and quiet. Was the lawyer who helped Laura from your high school arranged by you? He asked. I suddenly felt like doing something good. Chris held me close, lowered his head with a hint of stubble on his chin, and rubbed his head against mine gently. Could you do one more good thing for me? I asked. What is it? Without a word, Chris went back to the room and changed into a white shirt. He rarely wore white, but when he did, He had an air of immaculateness, combined with his excessively handsome face. My heart unexpectedly raced, and my mind went blank for a couple of seconds before I mumbled to him, "What do you want me to do?" He walked closer, looked at me with a serious gaze and said, "When you woke up, I asked if you would want to be buried with me if you died." I didn't understand what he meant at first. It was only when the screen was filled with live comments that I realized Chris was proposing to me. I didn't know if I was touched or angry. I punched his chest angrily. "You jerk, who proposes like this?" Chris laughed, grabbed my hand, and kissed the back of it gently. Then he took out a diamond ring and put it on my ring finger. Stunned, I said, "Don't you even want to know if I agree?" He smiled. "I know you do." Unlike before, the live comments disappeared before Chris leaned in to kiss me, and that prolonged, passionate kiss lasted for quite a while. Chris wiped away the tears at the corner of my eye and softly said, "There was something I seemed to forget to tell you earlier. Vera, I love you, for a long time."